Hello and good afternoon to all participants. Can you hear me clearly? I hope yeah, thank you. I'm Mohammad Shabar from BHRC. Welcome all of you dear ones to our workshop. Today's workshop is the 14th workshop of NaDiMa meetings entitled of Sustainable Development and Disaster Risk Reduction. This workshop will be held in 2 days in collaboration with the University of Marburg, APDIM, and BHRC and University of Tehran. And today and Sunday, this workshop will be held on it. Dr. Mohaghegh from APDIM will tell you more detail about the workshop. But before we start, let me introduce Dr. Mohaghegh to inform the participant. Dr. Mostafa Mohaghegh is a senior coordinator at the Asia and Pacific Center for Development of Disaster Information Management, APDIM, a regional institute of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, UNSCAP, based in Tehran. He has over 25 years of experience in disaster management and risk reduction, as well as in the humanitarian action at national, regional, and international levels. He has worked in International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement and in the United Nations. Dr. Mohaghegh, it's up to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shahwar. I hope my voice can be heard loud and clear. Can you please confirm that so I can continue my speech? Okay, so
I can.
Yeah, I received several confirmation. Thank you very much for that. Well, first, at the outset, I wish to thank Dr. Shawar and all colleagues in Marburg University and Building and Housing Research Center, BHRC of Iran, for organizing these important and enlightening dialogues and workshops and events on the very important and pertinent topics of the day globally and worldwide. I see that among the participants we have very good diversity of participants from different countries and from different disciplines and areas of expertise. That's very encouraging. And hello all to all, and my welcome to all of you and thank you for your participation. And of course we had many more participants, but I guess there might be always the problem of the connectivity. So I hope that others who have registered can also join as soon as they can. I plan to organize or hold this workshop from my side in a very interactive way. So I really appreciate your participation during this difficult COVID-19 time, where we had less and less in-person meeting, and we became more dependent on digital, online, and actually virtual type of meetings. So I will open the floor and give you a chance for your questions and comments after each session of my presentation. And then we will have toward end of the workshop actually about an hour working groups discussion. I will explain about it, about the questions and tasks of the working groups or breakout sessions, and how actually all of us can be accommodated or assigned to these breakout sessions. So allow me to start my presentation, and I'm very well aware of the value of the timing and the opportunity that is given to all of us. So therefore I try to make the best use of the time that we have put together here. And as I mentioned, after each section I will open the floor and we can listen to each other, other comments, questions or clarifications, and hopefully at the end of the two-day session we all can feel that we are taking away some more tangible, useful actually outputs. And while today's session is more on the concepts and frameworks and the basic sort of conceptual frameworks of the topics, and then on Sunday we will have more practical exercise and with more concrete issues and the themes that could help us to go deep into the issues and then come up with the hopefully useful outputs and outcomes. So let me start with the objective of this workshop. You have seen in the poster of the event that the objectives of the workshop are two. First, to analyze the relationship between sustainable development and disaster risk reduction, and two, to examine methodologies for integration of disaster risk reduction in development sectors planning. So today we will deal with the first objective, and that is to analyze the relationship between sustainable development and disaster risk reduction. And then on Sunday we will work on the second objective, and that is the methodologies for integration of disaster risk reduction in development sectors planning. Before I move further, I want to share with you actually the context of these issues. Regardless of the discipline or area of study or academic background that you are coming from, the issue of the sustainable development and disaster risk reduction is among most pertinent topics nowadays at global level. So no country, no nation, no community, no one is immune with regard to the risk and negative impacts of disasters, and therefore we have to deal with that. This is why at global level, at national level, academic sort of circles, in executive bodies, everywhere, disaster risk reduction and development is coming. Therefore, I can very safely say that you will be able to comfortably apply these topics in your areas of studies, whether it's urban planning or is it environment or engineering, medicine, socio-economic areas, and even in humanities if you go further. So I just want to highlight the fact that disaster risk reduction and sustainable development is pertinent to all of us. Okay, let's start with the key concepts. First, on the sustainable development. You're all aware that in 2015, international community, all countries, through the framework of the United Nations, adopted a series of very, very important international frameworks and agreements. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which was adopted by all United Nations states in 2015, is about providing a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet, now and into the future. At its heart are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which are urgent call for action by countries, developed and developing, in a global partnership. So if you look at the highest level of desirable outcome, you're talking about peace and prosperity. I think nothing is more important or valuable or higher than these two. We need a peaceful world and we need prosperity, which includes economic prosperity, welfare, income, growth, development, whatever you can call it, and include it. So this is the highest level statement of desirable outcomes that human being may have actually at global level. And then these are broken into 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which are committed to be achieved in 15 years from 2015 to 2030. Okay, so I am reminded that my voice is not very clear. I hope that you can hear me very well. If there is a problem with my voice, please write in the chat box and remind me so I can make sure that you can hear me well. Okay, then for your information, I think all of us, we should be aware that in 2015 there were 4 very, very important high-level global frameworks and agreements which were adopted. One of them is Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which was adopted in March 2015 during the 3rd United Nations Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Sendai in Japan. And that was actually leading to a global framework which is called Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which succeeded the previous framework, which was called the Hyogo Framework for Action, and that was from 2005-2015. So disaster risk reduction framework globally is Sendai Framework. And then in the same year, 2015, there was another important global framework which was called Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development. That was the question about financing and resourcing development programs in July 2015. And then, as I mentioned, the Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and 17 SDGs were the other important framework which was adopted 2015. And then last but not least, Paris Agreement on Climate Change. You have heard that these days we have this COP26, which is countries of parties to climate change agreement, and here actually we have Paris Agreement 2015. That's another important. So if you want to be sufficiently knowledgeable about the global agenda on development, disaster reduction, climate change, these are the 4 important global frameworks that you should be aware of, and you should be well acquainted, knowledgeable about it, read them, and more importantly to identify and understand the relationship among these 4 global frameworks, because they have been negotiated, they have been prepared, and they have been adopted altogether by member states. Okay, let's review these SDGs that I'm sure everyone is aware of it, but that's useful to go through it one by one and see that what are the important critical areas that the international community and countries have identified to be at the top of the list of the Sustainable Development Goals. The first goal of the SDGs is end poverty in all its forms and everywhere. So ending poverty is the #1 goal in this list of 17 Sustainable Development Goals. #2 is end hunger, achieve food security and improved nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. So #2 is about the ending the hunger and food security. #3, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. So #3 comes health and well-being. Goal number 4 is ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So number 4 comes education. And then we have number 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. So we have gender, women and girls. Number 6, ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. That's clear, water and sanitation. Number 5, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all. That's about energy. Goal number 8, promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Full and productive employment and decent work for all. That's about economic growth, employment and work for all. Goal number 9, build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization and foster innovation. Goal number 10, reduce inequality within and among countries. So inequality is interesting. It's not an area or a discipline, it's a quality that has been put as an independent goal among the 17 SDGs to be reduced. Goal number 11, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So that's about the cities and human settlements. Goal number 12 is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns that can go across all sectors. Goal number 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. So climate change has been put as an independent, high-level goal. Goal number 14, conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Goal number 15, protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. Number 16, promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. And number 17, the last SDG, strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. So as you can see, these 17 Sustainable Development Goals some of them are sectors and disciplines and issues such as climate change, education, hunger, poverty, and some of them are actually challenges which are cost-cutting and common, such as inequality, such as inclusion, and etc., etc. That's actually how the SDGs are formed up and shaped up for 15 years, 2015 until 2030. So all of them are actually in different figures and diagrams. I'm sure you have seen. Okay, I'm receiving messages that my voice or sound is not well. Maybe you could try to use an external microphone from your headphone or instance. Let me check with the participants if I can be heard. No, it's clear. Okay, if it's clear, then it's good news. I can continue, but please let me know if there is a problem again. So that was actually sort of a glance over the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. In a nutshell, you can see it in this diagram. And it is important to compare whatever we do with this actually a set of sustainable goals. So there are a number of important points. First, these are not United Nations produced goals. These are countries of the world, all together adopted this list of goals. And then Under each goal you have targets, indicators, and I recommend you all look at those indicators and then supplementary documents. I've shared the link through the information note for the session. I'm sure you have seen it. So you have to go through it and then find the dynamics among them. And then probably it's a good exercise that you check whatever you do in academic centers, in offices, in executive areas, how your work corresponds to these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. To which of them? We do it in the United Nations. We have to do it. So every year when we plan, we say that our activity corresponds to these areas. For example, my work, which is on disaster information management and disaster risk reduction, I say that it contributes to number 1, ending poverty, and then to number 2, ending hunger and food security, because if we develop our disaster information management system and knowledge, we'll be able to reduce the risk, and then we'll be able to reduce the impact of the disasters on agriculture, on food products, and then as such we contribute to reducing the hunger. So all of you can check actually whatever you do or whatever you study or your area of expertise or interest, how they correspond to these Sustainable Development Goals in general. Okay, just for your information, I want to share with you here a diagram which shows what the United Nations, as the largest international multilateral system which has membership of all countries, is doing in general. So we can see where sustainable development actually falls. Whatever UN is doing can be, or all what UN is doing can be actually grouped into three actually sectors. One of them is development areas, as we have been discussing a little bit. Okay, let me go to this diagram. I hope you all can see it. And that's very important for you to understand what the United Nations is doing in general, globally and worldwide. So there are three areas. One of them is development, as I mentioned, on education, agriculture, health, medicine, etc., etc. Second area is humanitarian, and here humanitarian means sort of extraordinary support and services that communities and people need if there is an emergency, a disaster, or actually sort of extraordinary situation. And the third area is peace. You know about the UN peace keepers and the forces that they send around the world actually to intervene among the armed conflicts, and then etc., etc. These three areas of engagement of the UN is based on the United Nations Charter and the mandate which is given to it. So if you open the United Nations Charter, you can see that from the beginning, we the United Nations, etc., etc., first peace and peaceful settlement of the disputes, etc., goes to development, humanitarian afterward, etc., etc. Here you can see that there are nexus relations between three of them. So if you consider, for example, development and humanitarian sectors, we have a very important issue today globally which is called humanitarian development nexus. And that means how development programs and humanitarian programs can be integrated and synergized so they can have better result. Or development and peace. You have here development peace nexus. What are the relationship between development in the developing or underdeveloped countries and the status of peace or non-peace in these countries? Or you can have the nexus between humanitarian and peace. We have many countries where you have humanitarian emergencies because of the drought, because of the flood, because of the pandemics, and at the same time you have actually armed conflicts there. So we have the issue of the humanitarian peace nexus. If you put three together, then we have a triple nexus. So ideally, the best situation is where in a community or a country or a region, we have development programs like education, health, agriculture, energy, etc., etc., with the humanitarian interventions like emergency food, medicine, relief, rescue, etc., and with peace building or peacekeeping efforts together. That's the ideal alignment or synergy as we speak about the So this slide actually was showing what United Nations programmatic areas are globally, depending on the needs and demands of the countries. Let me see if before we move to the next concept, which is disaster risk reduction, I want to pause and stop here for some moments, some minutes. If anybody has a question or comment or clarification, please raise your hand. You can see in the top of the page, in the screen, there is an icon for hand. You can actually raise your hand, and I hope you can be given the floor or a mic and make your point, please. Yeah. Or so feel free to use your mic to ask questions, discuss, etc. This is the message from colleagues. Whenever there are open questions, you should all have the possibility to unmute yourself at the top. Mic icon. Okay, this note is also useful, so you can use the mic icon in the top of the screen and speak if you wish so. Any questions, comments, or contribution from anybody is welcome. Yeah. Okay. So not much at this stage as we speak about the concepts and frameworks. So probably okay, yeah. Now I hope that my camera also is working, and at the same time the voice is okay. Okay. Let me move to the second concept. So we briefly reviewed the concept of the sustainable development. Of course, there are a lot of issues and content that you can read, but that was the purpose of this presentation, to have an agreement on the concept and definition of sustainable development. Let's move to the second concept of this workshop, and that is disaster risk reduction. There are a lot of models and definitions. I try to share with you some key ones which are globally and internationally agreed on, so with least ambiguity. For your information, if you wish to refer to the most reliable and officially endorsed terminology, you can always refer to UNDRR terminology, which is the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. It's a very famous office and also famous terminology. So that terminology and definition is prepared and regularly updated in consultation with the experts from around the world and agencies, so that's very reliable and most consensual terminology that you have in access. So what the UNDRR terminology says about disaster risk reduction says that disaster risk reduction is aimed at preventing new and reducing existing disaster risk and managing residual risks, all of which contribute to strengthening resilience and therefore to achievement of sustainable development. From now on, everywhere in disaster risk reduction terminology and definitions, you will see that at the end it says it contributes to sustainable development. And that is the reason why disaster risk reduction and sustainable development are internally actually interlinked, and they actually go hand in hand. So disaster risk reduction is aimed at reducing, preventing new and reducing existing disaster risk and managing residual risk. Residual risk is the risk which is accumulated because of the previous context and situations, and has come to a certain degree that can actually lead to a disaster. When we look at the annotation for this definition, we say that disaster risk reduction is the policy objective of disaster risk management, and its goals and objectives are defined in disaster risk reduction strategies and plans. You may see and hear a lot about of these terms: disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management, preparedness, response, resilience, etc. So let us agree in this definition that disaster risk reduction is the policy objective. I would appreciate it if you could please mute your mic when you don't speak and when I speak, and when you wish to take the floor, then you can unmute and speak. Thank you very much. So here, the critical term here is the policy objective of disaster risk management. So disaster risk management is a process through which actions are taken, resources are allocated, etc. And then the policy objective, what is the overall objective of disaster risk management, is disaster risk reduction. So that can be everywhere, across all sectors. Let's move on here and to visualize a little bit the key drivers and factors of disaster risk. We can see that the key drivers and factors and causes of disaster risk are three. First, we call it hazard, which is the dangerous phenomenon. It can be a natural hazard, such as the flood, earthquake, a landslide, drought, tsunami, whatever it can be, or it can be actually human-induced hazards, such as the accident, industrial incidents, etc., etc. So the first factor is hazard. Then the second factor or driver is vulnerability, which is our internal weakness and our internal problems. That's about physical vulnerability, such as weak buildings and structures which are not resilient against earthquake. Or it could be social vulnerability, for example, the movement or migration of the people from rural areas to urban areas, and then creation of informal human settlements or slums, or actually weak housing. The third type of vulnerability is economic. You have here poverty, because poverty doesn't allow the people to build safe houses and resilient settlements. Or it could be lack of insurance for disasters, or it could be lack of investment for disaster reduction. So economic vulnerability is so important. And then we have environmental vulnerability. The degradation of the land or natural resource management not properly done, or the mismanagement of the water and other resources, deforestation, etc., are one of the type of vulnerabilities that can create disaster risk. And then we have coping capacity. If the coping capacity is not enough, there is weakness in people, resources, organization, or adaptive capacity to adapt to the new circumstances. These are all type of vulnerabilities. And then we have the exposure, which is the exposure of structures, population, agriculture, business assets to hazard and disaster risk. Let me give you one example so it can be totally clear. Let's say about earthquake. Earthquake is a what we call it sudden onset disaster, and let me share actually examples of Iran and Japan. We have several participants from engineering and urbanization actually sector. Iran and Japan are both highly disaster prone countries, especially against seismic risks and hazards such as earthquake. So in Japan, when we look at this diagram, the hazard side is high. Usually there are big earthquakes in Japan. Let's say from 1 to 10 degree or grade. Let's say Japan has 8 or 7, whatever, usually high. But on the vulnerability side, Japan is much better because there is less physical, social, economic, environmental vulnerability. It has a strong and resilient infrastructure, so vulnerability is low. And then exposure also because of the good urban planning, spatial planning, etc., is low. Therefore, the overall earthquake risk in Japan is low, although the hazard is high. But in Iran, of course, colleagues from BHRC or experts can correct me. Usually the earthquakes in Iran are weaker, smaller than the earthquakes in Japan. We don't have such strong earthquakes as they have in Japan. But on the vulnerability side, unfortunately, in Iran is higher. Physical vulnerability, social, economic, environmental, etc., and exposure also is high. This is why the overall risk of earthquake in Iran is more than Japan. Not because of the earthquake as a natural phenomenon, because Japan has a much bigger earthquake, because of the vulnerability and exposure side. That gives us the result that the determining factor in disaster risk is not nature. Nature actually has no sort of role, or nature should not be blamed for disaster risk. Or one who should be blamed is the human and also human societies and infrastructures and what we call it built environment. This is the determining factor. So just briefly, you can see that the key factors of disaster risk are hazards, vulnerability, and exposure. And if these three come together, then we can identify the risk of certain disasters or certain hazards. Let me know if anywhere you have a question or comment. Please raise your hand or take the mic and you can intervene. Yeah, okay. Another important concept and term which is very common these days, and you hear a lot about it, that's the resilience. Again, if you look at the official terminology of UNDRR, it says that resilience is the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards. You just saw in the previous slide that we had exposure to hazards, to resist. So the ability to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt to, transform, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner, including through the preservation and restoration of its essential basic structures and functions through risk management. I want to spend a few moments on this and then want to get back to the previous slide to look again at the key factors of disaster risk. So this is the anatomy or analysis of disaster risk. Now we have seen that disaster risk is generated and is created because of three factors. One is the hazard, the other one is vulnerability, the third one is exposure. Okay, that's noted. Now, what can we do about it? One solution is resilience, to create and enhance resilience. And then we have to see what resilience is and how it can be enhanced. So the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards to resist. So the first ability is to resist, absorb the shock, the stress, accommodate, accept it in, and adapt to, transform, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner, including through preservation and restoration of its essential basic structures and the functions through risk management. I want to stress on this critical word, which is functions. So resilience is not simply that the building or infrastructure do not collapse. No. In addition to resistance and not collapsing, they should be able to continue their functions. So we call a society or a community resilient when and if they not only could resist and survive in a disaster, but also could continue their functions. For example, regarding the hospitals in disasters, if there is a big disaster and the hospitals remain safe, so there is no any physical damage on hospitals, the buildings, the equipment is actually there, so no one is hurt and no part of the hospital building is damaged. But if this hospital, which has survived and has no damage, has problem in providing its services to the public or to those who are injured or those who are in need of services for any reason, which even can be outside the hospital, we don't call this hospital resilient. This hospital is not resilient because this hospital was not able to keep and maintain its functions. Although the building remained safe, but the functions did not continue, therefore this hospital is not resilient. This applies to all sectors. So if you want to have a resilient system, resilient community, resilient society, whatever, resilience means not only to survive, to resist, but also to keep and maintain the functions. If the functions are not continued, then this system or community is not resilient. That's a very important point regarding the definition of resilience as we speak. Okay, this is a very classical diagram showing the disaster risk management cycle. You know all about it, just as a sort of reiteration. When we talk about disaster risk management cycle, we're talking basically about four main areas or angles or categories of actions. First, on the top left, we have prevention and mitigation. Building better and safer buildings, better use of natural resources, energy management, etc., etc. Urban planning, these are all prevention and mitigation. The next part of this cycle is preparedness. Okay, we will not be able to prevent disasters 100% because there will be always a disaster. We can prevent many of them, but not all of them. Therefore, we have to be prepared to face the disasters. And preparedness here means two things. One, the organizations have the readiness and the capacity to respond. And secondly, people have the preparedness that can actually protect themselves with the help of the authorities organization. So when we did preparedness, then finally we will face the disaster. And then when the disaster occurs, we will respond. So we provide emergency response, rescue, relief, shelter, food, health, hygiene, etc., etc. And then when the response phase is over, we start the recovery. And recovery means short-term like rehabilitation and long-term like reconstruction. And then recovery should continue again to the prevention and mitigation. Can I raise a question now here, just for your interaction, so we can hear also your voice? Which parts of this cycle is related to sustainable development? Please, feel free to take the mic and intervene and make your point and voice your comments here. So question is that which parts of this cycle is related to sustainable development? So I could also, as we have a very informal workshop, look at the names and then maybe suggest some participants make a phone, actually. Let's start with, let me see, actually. We have Marius in the workshop. Marius Koppen. I can see.
Yes, I'm here. Can you
Yeah,
hear me?
don't worry, it's a very informal and comfortable, friendly conversation. So tell me, what do you think about it? My question was that which part of this cycle, of these 4 parts of the cycle, is related to sustainable development, please?
I think probably, I'd say prevention and mitigation, but also to some extent preparedness, because I mean, if the process of sustainable development is managed in a good way, then I think that should mainly contribute to the like the initial phases. So, but yeah,
Okay,
now that I
very
think
good.
about it,
Very good.
I think
Very
it
good.
could also
Yeah, please go ahead. Mention your point. Make your
No,
point.
I was just thinking out loud that basically it could also, I think it affects all of the 4 stages, but
Yeah.
because in some way I think, but
Yeah. Very good. Any other points? Anyone else want to make a comment before I mention the names?
Hello everyone.
Yes,
Can you
please.
hear me well? Oh, so
Yes.
first of all, before this workshop, I just thinking that the all 4 parts should be somehow related to the sustainable development, because the sustainable development is an overarching goal. So each step should be sustainably planned and should sustainability be done. So in my point of view, so the all 4 parts are somehow related to the sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you give an example? I mean, prevention and mitigation is clear. Sustainable, because
Yeah.
it's about urban planning, environment, but about the preparedness and response. Do you have any example
Yeah.
how preparedness and response are
You
related
know,
to sustainable
yeah,
development?
of course. Yeah, of course. Preparedness is something that we should we should have some plans, or mainly providing some strategic plans to be prepared for many disasters. So any plan or any roadmap for coping with disaster should consider the sustainability principles. For example, we should be aware about the things or the actions to be sure that they are not compromising the social or the environmental rights of the current and future generation. And for response, now I don't have anything in my mind, but you know, response is the actions, I think. So,
Yeah.
so the
Yeah.
actions should be done in the same way to do not, for example, hurt the environment, you know, yeah, something
Yeah.
like that.
Exactly. Exactly. Very good.
Thank you.
I think they are very, very relevant. I just also from my experience, I've used many years in the past in humanitarian emergency response, preparedness response, so I can share with you my examples. With regard to preparedness, you know that one part of preparedness is public education and raising awareness of the people. How they can be prepared against disasters, communities, people, etc. So when it comes to education, education is first and foremost a development topic. Huh? We're talking about science, technology, education, culture, etc. But when it comes to preparedness, we see that yes, there is need for education, training, etc., etc. So here, the nexus or relationship between sustainable development and preparedness can be defined as that the official national education of the countries, like the school educations or curricula, can include education and training on people preparedness against disasters. So if the school curricula and books include a chapter, I don't know, a lesson, whatever, about the preparedness against disasters in the people, then we have created this nexus or relation between development aspects of education, public education in school, and also the preparedness which needs actually training against disasters. And on the response, you're absolutely right. If you want to help 50,000 people in a aftermath of a disaster like earthquake or flood or whatever, even refugees, and you need to set up a tent for each 5%, then you need to set up 10,000 tents. And this we have done it many times in the past. I've been involved in it. So the relationship here is that with the development part, which is environment, and also health and hygiene, where and how you set up these 10,000 tents. Because if 50,000 people want to settle in 10,000 tents in 6 months, 1 year in a big area, then it will have environmental consequences. So how we do the response and intervention, we can do it in an environment-friendly way so that we consider environmental sort of factors in even emergency response and setting up the tents for the people who are affected by disaster. So there is a question, how come preparedness is separated from prevention? I believe that preparedness is somehow in the heart of the prevention or vice versa. Yes and no. It depends on the measures. When we say prevention and mitigation, we are talking about the root causes, long-term measures. For example, urban development and urbanization to be done in such a way that prevents future risks. We do not build buildings on the earthquake fault line, or we consider the population density, or we consider meteorological hazards when we are sort of developing a new urban area. These are long-term development matters. Preparedness, as I mentioned, is about two things. One is the readiness of responsible organizations to respond, and the second one is preparedness of the people, the knowledge, awareness, the skills, how to protect themselves. When there's an earthquake, basic skills should be taught and available with the people. So, therefore, a more correct term for preparedness is preparedness for response. And this is also used in many places, organizations. They do not say preparedness. They say preparedness for response. And then we have response. And by using the term preparedness for response, then this ambiguity or the problem that you mentioned, Madam Mahsa Meskeroni, right? In the chat box, I think that will be solved, hopefully. Okay. Okay, good. Let's move on to the next. Okay, let's quickly review. We talked about the definition of disaster risk reduction, and it's different to disaster risk management, which is a process. We talked about the key factors of disaster risk, hazard, vulnerability, exposure. We talked about the definition and importance of functions continuity in addition to the prevention of the systems and structure from collapsing. Then we talked about the disaster risk management cycle as a brief actual review. Now, what are the existing global frameworks for disaster risk reduction? On the sustainable development, we saw that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and 17 Sustainable Development Goals or SDGs have been adopted. How about disaster risk reduction? What is the global framework for that? The most important, highest level global framework for disaster risk reduction is Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which was adopted by 164 countries in 2015 during the third United Nations Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Sendai, Japan, and that is for 15 years, 2015 to 2030. And of course, because this was a very important document for Persian-speaking participants and colleagues, the Persian translation of it is available. I did the translation with the help of some friends and colleagues in 2015. And if you type in Google in Persian, چارچوب سندای برای کاهش خطر بلایی or Sendai framework, then you can reach that translation into Farsi. So the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which is the most important and overarching global framework, has one expected outcome, and that is the substantial reduction of disaster risk and losses in lives, livelihoods, and health, and in the economic, physical, social, cultural, and environmental assets of persons, businesses, communities, and countries. So this is the highest level expected outcome of this framework. In order for this outcome to be realized and achieved, then a goal has been introduced in the framework, and that is the goal of the Sendai framework is to prevent new and reduce existing disaster risk through the implementation of integrated and inclusive economic, structural, legal, social, health, cultural, educational, environmental, technological, political, and institutional measures that prevent and reduce hazards, exposure, and vulnerability to disaster, increase preparedness for response and recovery, and thus strengthen resilience. So in this goal, you have all key terms and the expressions as we discussed, like the resilience, like the hazard, exposure, vulnerabilities, and very interestingly, you can see that there are a lot of focus and emphasis on the economic and the social side. So that I can tell you that is a new phenomenon globally. 20 years ago, development communities and agenda was one side, and then humanitarian disaster risk reduction other side. There was no relationship. But especially since 2015, the world has come to the conclusion that the only effective way to prevent disasters is to correct development policies and programs. So if we do urbanization, it should be in such a way that does not create risk, like slums, informal settlements, etc. So if we want to use the natural resources, then it should be not creating actually a sort of degradation in environment and deforestation, etc. This is why in a disaster risk reduction framework you see so many development terms: economic, structural, legal, social, health, educational, environment, and that's a big message, that today they are all integrated and move hand in hand. So there are 4 priorities for action for 15 years and then 7 targets that are important to consider. So what the world has globally agreed as priorities for action for 15 years, 2015-2030, are actually 4 priorities. First, understanding disaster risk. And that needs a bit of more attention. First, understanding is not learning or is exploring or is analyzing. Understanding is the deepest level of knowledge. It means that we should deeply understand, deeply know, deeply learn the factors and the drivers of what? Of disaster risk. What is risk? Again, I refer to the 3 factors: hazard, vulnerabilities, and exposure, with all its sort of modalities and the drivers, as we spoke. The second priority for action in Sendai framework is strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. What does it mean, disaster risk governance? Has anybody any idea or example of what disaster risk governance would be? Because we have disaster risk management, reduction, system, tools, but what is governance in disaster risk? That should be strengthened. Any idea, any thought?
So I think the governance, it means the rules and norms or the structures, or mainly it's related to the institutions, the rules of the game in a society. Yeah, it's something like that, I think.
Yes, I think that's almost it. Disaster risk governance, as you mentioned, is the set of rules and big systems and higher level norms that govern the safety, resilience, risk reduction regime, or actually systems or processes in a country. For example, the constitutional law or a parliamentarian laws on the health, on, let's say, driving, on education, on environment, etc., etc. These are governing rules and laws and acts that sets the norm of the safety and resilience and well-being of the people in the country. So the difference is that when we talk about disaster risk governance, we are not talking about the disaster risk managers or actually rules and regulation in response or in, no, that's highest level actually rules that govern at the country level. Okay, number 3, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. It needs investment. The term investment is used instead of spending or resource allocation or whatever, because investment should pay back. So it says that if you invest in disaster risk reduction, then it pays back. Based on the latest analysis of the United Nations, if countries spend $1 in disaster resilience, then they will economize or prevent spending $15 for disaster losses. That's the latest. So there were different estimations in the past, but the latest is interesting because it says that investment resilience for $1 will prevent spending $15 for disaster loss. And it is based on the several calculations and analysis at national level budgets that are available if someone is interested. And then priority number 4, enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. So the question that Mahsa Meskarani asked now here actually is also responded. So we say preparedness for effective response, not preparedness general. And then the critical term, build back better. Recovery is not to build back what already existed before disaster, so we build it again. No. It should be building back better. Not like before, but better than before. It means safer than before, more resilient than before. These days there is a new term, it's called build forward better. So why we should build back better? So now in the literature of disaster risk reduction, you can see that some are using the new term build forward better. Let's look forward and see what would be the better options and the potentials for building or for developing. And then recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction that are all mentioned. So these are the 4 priorities for action. Again, as you can see, is very much development oriented. And number 4 is just to focus on the preparedness, response, and recovery, which is always needed. So in addition to 4 priorities for action, Sendai framework has also 7 targets. And this is one of the big differences between Sendai framework and its predecessor, which was Hyogo framework for action from 2005 and until 15. Because in the Hyogo, there were priorities for action, there were 5, but there were no targets. Target here means tangible objectives that can be achieved in 15 years. So there are 7 targets in Sendai framework. 4 of them is about reducing. So on the purple left side, you can see that there are 4 targets that should be substantially reduced: global mortality, disaster mortality, number of affected people, economic loss in relation to GDP, and the damage to critical infrastructure. These 4 should be reduced, and there are numbers and indicators for it in the framework. You can see it. Next to it, there are 3 actually areas that should be increased substantially. Number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies. This should be increased, and there should be international cooperation increased, and availability and access to early warning, etc., should be increased. From 2016, 1 year after Sendai framework was adopted, each of these target has been selected as the theme for International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. And then this year, 21, we had the 6th target, which was international cooperation and to developing countries. And then next year we will have the 7th target, which will be the last target of the 7 targets of Sendai framework. That's then about the targets. If you see at the targets, you can see again the correlation between development and disaster risk reduction agendas. So now we have seen a little bit of the both sustainable development and disaster risk reduction domains. We have seen already the correlations and relationship between the 2, but in order to phrase them and put them in outlines, we can say that there is reciprocal relation between sustainable development and disaster risk for sure. As a result, disaster imposes heavy damages on communities and countries, and thus delay development of countries by reducing available human capitals and assets and interrupting planning. And that is not a estimation. One of the countries in the Pacific some years back was about to graduate from the level of least developed countries, LDCs, to the developing countries level. You know that UN has a system that countries through some long-term plans, programs and efforts can graduate. So this country was about to be graduated from least developed countries level to the developing countries, and in an official annual meeting of the UN there was a ceremony to celebrate this graduation. A few weeks before that celebration there was a huge storm and cyclone in the Pacific which affected and destroyed much part of this country, the island. The damage was to the extent that returned the country from the newly graduated developing country level back to least developed countries. And then the graduation was cancelled because the country had to spend a few more years to get back to that level. So disaster damages can easily return countries backward and remain long-term negative impacts, so that can delay their development. Disaster impose considerable losses on communities and countries, and thus increase the economic potential of society by exacerbating poverty, inequalities, unemployment, disrupting small business and industry activities. Has anybody any thought or idea about the difference between the damages and losses? Any comment or intervention, please? So let's see if, okay. Damages is usually short-term physical negative impacts of disasters, such as destruction of the buildings, pipelines, agricultural land, etc. So the losses is the economic long-term negative impact, such as destroying the employment opportunities or productivity or GDP, etc., etc. And in the third bullet point is mentioned that these two can be compared with iceberg tip. You can see that in the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, which is visible above the sea or water level, is a small part, but the bigger part, which is not visible, is under the water. So here, usually disasters have a very visible effects, and that is the destruction of buildings, roads, infrastructure, etc. This is a small part of the impact of disasters, which is called damage. The bigger, longer-term impact of disasters, which is not visible, is the loss. Like the destroying the employment opportunities, productivity, agriculture, economic growth, education, etc., etc., etc. And this is huge. So in any disaster, we say that we have short-term effect, which is response and food, shelter, education, reconstruction, and we have a long-term effect that is called losses. So the relationship between sustainable development and disaster risk is especially in the area of loss, where the long-term negative impact of disaster can destroy the development gains and achievements of the country and push them back. Okay, here also another diagram for you to realize that it's not only us that we are doing disaster risk reduction. Actually, the wrong development patterns and policies and programs generate and create disaster risk constantly. So there are two runners or two persons who are running very fast. The first one is the risk generation, risk creation because of the wrong development. Socio-economic development, urban, rural, natural resources, energy, water, etc., etc. The speed of this runner is so high. And then the second runner is speed of disaster risk reduction. All countries do to prepare, to mitigate, to reduce the risk. The speed of disaster risk reduction is much lesser or lower than the risk generation. What does this diagram say is that if we move with the same speed in disaster risk reduction, we don't get anywhere. We should reach to the speed of risk generation and creation in two ways. One, to a speed of a risk reduction, to increase our risk reduction speed as fast as possible. And the second one, to reduce the speed of risk generation by improving our development policies, programs, as we discussed. So that is a message that we are not alone and we don't have a lot of time to reduce disaster risk. We should be fast because next to us there is this generation with this development, wrong development, which is going very, very fast. And as such, we won't be able to see the result of our disaster risk reduction efforts. So for your example, when it comes to the relationship between disaster risk reduction and the sustainable development, there is a model which is called AAL, or annual average loss of disaster risk. It's a sort of estimation that is done jointly some years back by UNHCR, also through Global Risk Assessment, Disaster Risk Reduction Assessment, or GAR, in consultation with World Bank and a few others. You can see here that for a multi-hazard average annual loss, which includes earthquake, flood, cyclone, wind, storm surge, and tsunami, how much the countries are exposed to the risk. And here, when we talk about the economic losses, then we look at the assets. This is why you see here countries like Japan, United States, Brazil, and Western Europe, they are more exposed to the risk of disasters because of their assets. For example, in Iran, the calculation was that Iran is exposed to economic loss of about $5 billion on annual basis. That's a calculation of both the hazard side and also the vulnerability and assets. Let's say oil refineries, or actually mines, or infrastructure, road, transportation, everything. And also you can see that in the many of developed countries, this risk is high because the exposure of their assets and properties and the people to hazard is high. And you have some developed countries such as Canada, for example, which is a developed country, but still the economic loss estimation is lower because the exposure of assets and properties is less to hazard. And here also you see that Germany, more or less the same, $5 billion per year is the economic loss estimation due to the exposure to hazards. So that's the relationship between the economic growth, development assets versus actually the hazards in the countries. And this is a very important study for the economic planners and development planners in the country to be aware that sustainable development is possible only through risk reduction. Because if you look only at the economic growth and infrastructure growth and do not look at the risk side, then you are more exposed to disaster risk. Okay, probably we are toward end of this presentation before our working group. Okay, let's look at this diagram 2, Sustainable Development, Disaster Risk Reduction, and Climate Change Nexus. These are the three most important overarching areas that are interacting. And then if we want to have a resilient development or resilience and development of communities, we have to look at 3 of them. Sustainable development, 17 sustainable development goals that we spoke, disaster risk management, Sendai framework we have, and then climate change and Paris Agreement. And all these 3 frameworks refer to each other, that they are achievable only hand in hand with other frameworks. And here when we talk about the resilience at its broadest term, which is called resilient, inclusive and sustainable development. This is the latest term globally. If you are interested to know what's happening in the world now, the today buzzword or actually term is resilient is an inclusive, sustainable and resilient development that countries should look for it. In order to achieve that, then we should pursue the sustainable development goals, we should pursue disaster risk reduction Sendai framework, and we should pursue climate change agreement, which is Paris Agreement and its associated actually terms. This is the best diagram that can show the relationship between the sustainable development, disaster risk reduction and climate change. Okay, this is the last slide of this presentation. I want to spend a few minutes on that, and then we will go to the breakout sessions for some working group actually works. Here, this is a very, very useful, important model. It's called Science Policy Practice Nexus. Very briefly, the problems and challenges that countries have, many of them, can be grouped in 3 categories. The first is on the science, research, studies, analysis, innovation, knowledge, etc., etc. And many countries are good in science. Germany, Iran, also many developing countries. Here, the science side, I think, is clear. So what science does is to help us understand and diagnose the problems. The upper side of the top left side of this diagram. So after we understood and diagnosed the problems, then the science also helps us to propose solutions. If there is a problem, then science and scientific community, universities can propose 100 solutions. What should be done next is to agree on the best solutions, and that's the definition of the policy. So policy these days, in its new definition, is not a high-level statement, political statement, no. Policy means to agree and reach a consensus on the best solutions that can help us solve the challenges. And that will bring us shared objectives, priorities, expected outcomes and impact, etc., etc. And one of them, for example, is the risk-informed development, people-centered, participatory. These are all policy issues. So when we talk about the policy, we talk about the approach, an agreement on the best solutions and the strategy and the methodology that can help us overcome the challenge based on the solutions that are introduced and proposed by the scientific community. And then we implement and agree the agreed actions, and monitor and learn, and this is the practice. Country level, system, organization, action plan, etc., etc. And then we do the evaluation and monitor the implementation of this thing. So in many countries today, the big problem is the middle one, policy. There are good scientists and there are good practitioners. There is enough knowledge, there is enough action. What is missing is the policy side with this new definition, and that's understanding and agreeing and consensus on the best solutions, how we tackle that. That collective agreement in the system and community and country is not enough. This is the what's called science policy practice nexus. They should be coming together. And the gap or crack between these actually three sectors is the key challenge. For example, the gap between science and practice, we call it knowledge and practice gap. Universities do the research and then executive organizations do the job. There is no relationship. In a more strategic level, this is called science policy practice nexus. So in order for us in the area of disaster risk reduction and sustainable development also be able to achieve our goals, we should ensure that there is linkage between science, policy, and practice, and policy with the definition that I explained. Based on that, now we have an exercise for about an hour and a half, and we have two questions for you. If Mr. Hoffman can, or maybe myself, I can actually present the two questions. Let me see. I don't have it here in the documents. Can you please share?
Sure, I added questions, yes.
Yeah, two questions. Thank you.
I shared them here in the chat.
Oh, in the chat. Okay. Is it possible also to share the document or no? So in the chat you will see that there are two questions for you. First, identify 5 important impacts of imbalanced and improper development programs on safety and resilience of people and communities. I gave you one example. For example, improper rural development will make the people migrate from rural areas to cities, and then in the cities they cannot afford expensive housing inside the cities. Then they go to the slums, informal cities around the cities, and then reside and live in unsafe settlements which are not resilient against disasters. So here one development challenge and wrong planning contributed to the disaster risk, because if there is an earthquake, the informal settlements would be the first to collapse or flood or etc. So please think about 5 important impacts that improper development planning and programs can have on the safety and resilience of people and create risk. The second question is that based on the model that I introduced, Science Policy Practice Nexus, provide 3 recommendations to improve policy making in development and disaster reduction. As you may recall, I said that many countries are good in science. We are not short of scientists. Many are good in action. There are many practitioners. What is the weak point and link is the policy making. So based on this model, what would be your 3 recommendations to improve policy making for development and disaster reduction? So here I would like to ask our colleague Mr. Hoffman to put all of us in 3 groups. I will be with the first group, and our colleague Dr. Atiye Ishaqi from BHRC will be in the Dr. Shahwar from BHRC will be in the second group, and then Dr. Atiye Ishaqi will be in the third group. We will have about an hour and a half to discuss that. These are very policy level and complex issues. Please take your time to discuss sufficiently whatever you like, and at the end come up with the response to these 2 questions, and one of you could make the presentation or report of your working group to the plenary that will be convened in 1 hour and a half from now. So that will be my time, local time in Tehran is 3:15. So 4:15, quarter to 5 Tehran time, and you can also adjust, synchronize your time. So all facilitators will be also available to help. After 1.5 hours, we reconvene and join in the plenary general one room, and we will hear the report from the 3 groups. Thank you. If there is a question or clarification to be made, please let me know. So, okay, welcome back everyone. Thanks for your collective effort. I think it was great. I enjoyed very much my working group, number 1. I'm sure others did too.
Yeah, it was really interesting, Dr. Mohaghegh. I really enjoyed it. I hope that other one enjoyed as well, but it was really fun. Thank you.
Great. So we'll see. We can judge on that by the report that will be presented to this session as final part of today. Okay. So let's, if you agree, let me start with the group number 1. So Mr. Shafi is presenting the report of group number 1. If I may suggest, keep all reports into 5 minutes maximum, but you can explain. You don't need to only read out the report, but also you can elaborate and explain if it's needed. Mr. Shafi, please go ahead for group number 1.
Hello everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. So we had a nice discussion over the 2 interesting questions, and for the first question we reached to 5 points. So I am reading the points. First is negative impacts of the ineffective programs implementation, especially when they are not collaboratively prepared. Therefore, the programs will not be successful. We all know that sometimes we may have some good plans or some very detailed plan, but the problem usually exists in the implementation parts because we forgot to involve and engage the influential stakeholder. So our first point was related to the negative impacts of the ineffective program implementation. The second one is increasing some of the negative impacts is related to increase rural immigration to cities and creation slums. So this is one of the negative social impacts actually. And the third one is the negative impacts of the mismanagement of natural resources like deforestation, disappearing of the lakes, and etc. And the fourth one is negative impacts of the improper urban planning on the resilience and safety on people. And the fifth point is we also have some non-physical impacts like the uneducation, lack of good preparedness policies, or sometimes we forgot to provide or define some capacity building programs. So these are our 5 points related to the first question. Now I will go for the recommendation related to the question number 2. So in our group discussion, we provided 4 recommendations. First one is providing means of implementation for turning the researchers or knowledge into innovation. So sometimes we have many publications, we have many good researchers, but the problem is that we don't consider the innovation process. We don't know how to turn them into some services, some products. And the second one is um, so achieving a shared vision at national, community, and level of and the so at the level of people. So one of the important things is that sometimes we are not on the same road. We don't know where is our destination. Then we need to define. We need to co-create a shared vision. So at different levels, like national, community, and individuals. And the third recommendation is related to engagement of citizens, universities, industry, and governments in policy making. We know that the policy making is a process. So this is a cycle which usually happens by cooperation between universities, industry, government, and also the people, the citizens. And the last one is related to providing and preparing guidelines and instructions for connecting these science, policy, and practices. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shafi. Before I open the floor for any comments, question, could you please turn on your camera and also the next presenters, so if possible, so the participant can see the image of the presenter while they are reporting. So anyone has any question or comments on the report of Group 1? Any clarification or question or comments?
Dr. Mohaghegh, I have just one suggestion. It was really interesting. I think if they can share like in the chat box, or maybe
Yes.
like a document that they can send it later, then this way, everyone can have access to their suggestion or their point at the end of the session as well. Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Thank you very much. Okay, let's then go to, yes,
Yeah,
Mr. Shafi will kindly share.
Sorry, I couldn't have access to the for sharing my for turning on my video. There is only one option for me. This is related to the mic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If it's possible, colleagues can activate also the camera for the speakers. That would be good. Yeah. Thank you so much. We can get back to this report later after listening to the other group's actual report. Can I invite the reporter of group number 2 to actually make the report, please? Who is doing that?
Dr. Mohaghegh, okay, Dr. Shahar, continue, please.
Actually, in my group, there is one active participant. We merge to the other groups, so we have only 2 groups.
All 2 groups, great. Okay.
Group, yeah.
Okay. Dr. Mohaghegh, I present the first question, and then because I didn't know that we lose the chat box, I couldn't get the points
Yes.
that my participants share. So later I will ask them to say their suggestions themselves. But for the first question, we had many good examples. I just tried to say it kind of fast and not really too long. So the first one is building of structures close to or near or on the active faults, I mean the seismically active faults, which will increase the seismic risk due to the large earthquake. This is really important issue, especially in Iran or even in Turkey or other countries that have high seismic risk. The second point is urbanization that destroys the natural resources. For example, deforestation is one of the examples that caused the increased risk of flooding. Again, we had this problem recently in Iran, I think in Europe as well, and this is something that is happening more often, and really it's a serious issue. The third one is heavy use of water resources. For example, in Iran, we do that. It leads to drought and increased risk of famine, Earth's subsidence, which is another risk because many structures, many facilities, many national resources that we have are in, really heavy or high risk because of this problem, and even it can lead to the wars between people from either one country, like city to city, or even country to country. So the problem of water resources is a really serious issue as well. This is one point that is really interesting, is growing economic might make the decision to satisfy their increasing energy demand with fossil fuels, but in the long run, a too slow transition to renewable energies will probably lead to higher electricity price. Again, this higher electricity price can hurt poorer households who may not be able to afford. For example, if there is a heat wave or if it's really cold, they cannot afford to pay for the electricity, and it's really important for those people, especially during the severe heat waves or cold weather. And another thing is not having a good urban planning for development of the cities. This leads to increased risk of natural disasters from all kinds. For example, if we do not consider the riverside, we can deal with the problem of flooding, having a higher risk for the people who are living beside those rivers. Or another example is lack of investment in green local public transportation, and focus on building more and better roads leads to air pollution. Again, this problem of air pollution harms people's health and make the more susceptible people more susceptible to disease like COVID. And another example is transportation development versus damages and losses, because if we do not consider all the technical strategy to do that, we can, for example, if we build the metro stations or metro line close to active fault, again it would increase the to have higher risk of natural disaster for that transportation line. This is the fifth point, but we have another one too, because it's really hot topic though. It's whatever action that increases CO2 emission, because for developing the industry, countries use the fossil fuels, and this lead to global warming, and again global warming would lead to many different type of natural hazards like storms, more heavy flooding, and it decreases the quality of life in that area. For the second question, I lost the chat box, so I asked Marius if you kindly give your points, the first 2 points that you mentioned, and then Masoud as well add 2 other points, and then this will be our final solution for your assignment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very
Marius, can you add?
Yeah, thank you. Yes. So yeah, I came up with 2 recommendations regarding the second question. The first one is more of a institutional recommendation, and that would be to set up an independent body of scientists that is able to work on recommendations without the interference of policymakers, and then give the means and opportunities to this body to make their recommendations known publicly, which could be a public press conference from time to time, for example. The second recommendation is to engage local stakeholders in the decision-making and implementation process to get a better understanding of possible conflicts between theory and reality, and in order to increase the acceptance of the affected people.
Okay.
Yes, so those
Thank
are
you very
my
much.
two recommendations.
Yes. I think
Thank you. Masood, can you add your 2 points? We have just 2 more for,
he
for
needs to be given access to the mic. Could colleagues give him the access to mic?
I think Masood can talk. Masood, can you talk? Oh, no.
Yes.
He
So
could
just
talk
then
to
please
us.
unmute if he's mute. I think his mic is not visible in the chat
Working.
box, so there might be something with that.
Okay, so as I remember, I can just say it in
Yeah.
short way because I just read it once, but he proposed to, Masood, are you here now? No. So he proposed that there should be a independent party to supervise somehow and find a conflict between the policy and the practice.
Yes.
Because sometimes we have good policy and we have people who want to apply these policies, but there are some conflicts. So there should be a third person to supervise and find this conflict and then resolve the issue, as I remember. So it should be the third point, and if it's possible, later maybe Masood can provide the points, and then we add it to the final notes from this group.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Eshad. I will keep the opportunity for Mr. Masood Fasali to provide his inputs. Thank you very much for 2 groups for your very rich reports. Obviously, these are very complex policy level, strategic issues, and I must admit that I was surprised pleasantly by the quality of the discussion in this workshop by these participants, because it's not usually easy when you deal with the very conceptual, abstract topics, and especially in applied science areas, engineering, environment, medicine, etc., is not very common. It is common to talk on strategic planning, but on the policy level issues is really very, very sort of rare to be discussing such abstract conceptual issues in a comprehensive manner. Anyway, I think that has been great to listen to all of you, and then comments I've been enjoying very much personally from the group that I was in. Very, very substantive, important points were mentioned. So I want to make an effort to make for myself a sense of all what have been said in few hours this afternoon as of a takeaway. So if we leave this workshop in 1 hour or so, or half an hour, etc., what would be our actually takeaways? What can we take from my side? Of course, everyone has his or her own takeaway and conclusion from the session. But I try actually to share my findings and conclusions. But before going to that part, I just want to open the floor and invite all participants to make any intervention or comments if they wish regarding the reports of the working group, or generally about the relationship between sustainable development and disaster reduction as we speak. So for reflection, so if there is any other points that have been missing in these two reports, and someone want to add on the impact of improper development programs on the safety and resilience of people and how they reduce the risk, or on the improving the policy making with regard to this science policy and practice nexus, please, the floor is open and you're welcome to add your comments and mention and make your points, please. Okay, as I speak, please make up your mind. If you have any thoughts or suggestions, please feel free to take the mic and speak, or raise your hand so I can see that. The first, I think, substantive and substantial point that we have seen in this discussion is that the time has changed, the world has changed. So whatever we do or we don't, anywhere, will have an impact on the prosperity, on the resilience, and the even risk of the people. So whether it's a building, or is it environment, or is it agriculture, or is it road transportation, or is it telecommunication, or even is an economic and social domain, social protection, services, investment, insurance, all what we do has an impact on our resilience and safety and the degree of risk to which we are exposed. So that's a critical point. And I can tell you, especially for our younger friends and participants, that 20 years ago, no one would imagine. Of course, I would like also to invite Dr. Farzanagan, who is present anytime he wants to make an intervention. Please, you're welcome actually to make your intervention. And at the end of the session today, we will, of course, hopefully listen to you. But 20 years ago, it was unthinkable that the people who deal with disaster management, risk reduction, humanitarian, and the people who deal with the development, sustainable development, education, health, urban planning, they could get together. No, it was unthinkable. So there were total separation between two communities. And I was one of those people who, for the first time from humanitarian community, in 2004, I attended the United Nations course actually on this topic, and but now it is inevitable. Everywhere we are seeing that humanitarian development actually actors and communities are working together, and disaster risk reduction. And this is not by accident. It is proof that the real and the original cause of disasters and disaster risk is not nature, is the improper and imbalanced development that human being actually is applying in its work. So in urban planning, agriculture, environment, natural resources, etc. So this is the first point, that whatever we do today has an impact on our resilience and safety, and also reducing or increasing actually the disaster risk. The second point, you can be very proud and happy that you are engaged in a policy discussion. This is today at global level very, very, very important and very new, because everyone has realized that the issue and the problem is not primarily in our knowledge and in our technical skills or in science or in our action. The problem is actually at policy level, and policy, as I explained in my presentation, is not a very important political high-level statement, a paper, and then the issue, and then put it somewhere. No. The modern time, today time, definition of policy is to agree, everyone, government, people, communities, institutions, scientific, executive, others, collectively agree on the solutions that can best help us to solve our problems. And this is lacking in many countries, not only in developing countries, also in developed countries in many places. And that means that everyone should be engaged in policy dialogue, from ordinary people in the communities, from education to agriculture to science, technology. So policy discussion is not limited to politicians. Policy debate and discussions and policy making is the responsibility of everyone, because agreement and engagement is responsibility of everyone. I think that's the second point, and I think we can be very proud today that we have discussed very, very high level strategic policy issues with regard to sustainable development and disaster reduction. This doesn't happen everywhere. So often people are used to very focused, technical, visual and tangible topics. Even in disaster reduction management, people think about tools, systems, techniques, methods, etc. But policy discussion doesn't happen, and that's very, very high top actually priority globally. That's the second point. Talking about the policy issues with this new definition. So if you go back to your university, seismology, urban planning, environment, Middle East studies, then please think about it, that what is missing is not knowledge. The problem is not lack of science. Of course, science can always evolve. Knowledge can improve. Technology can advance, no doubt about it. But compared to science and technology and knowledge, what we are behind is actually at policy discussions, and that's a policy dialogue. As it was mentioned in the reports of the groups, everyone, governments, people, communities, all actors should come together and have a very constructive policy discussions, and that means collective approach, collective solutions that can help us to overcome the challenges and take us forward toward our future: peace, prosperity, growth, development, welfare, well-being, resilience, safety, etc., etc. And I think the third point that I can make based on the discussion today is that the issues are very diverse, so we need to have multidisciplinary approach everywhere. It's impossible today someone who is studying medicine to say that, okay, no, environment and social science is not, no. Or someone who is studying seismology forgets the environment. Or someone who is studying environment say that, no, urban planning. It is impossible. So the issues are so intersected and interrelated and aligned that is impossible. And here I would like to share with you the three levels of impacts. If you want to have any impact in the community, in the country, in your university, everywhere, if you want to do something alone, you can do it very effectively, action. If you want to get higher and get result, you need to do it with other direct stakeholders, couple of universities, scholars, colleagues, institutions. But that's the result. This is the tangible, immediate outcome of your program. But it's not necessarily the impact that can change the life of the people. If you want to see the impact of your work and the positive change in the life of the people at community, country level, then you have to liaise and engage with all those who are involved, even for 1%, even those who are not around you. But they should be searched, they should be found, and the connection, as we call it, the value chain should be completed among all actions. So I think probably these were the three points I could capture and make out of the discussions today we had. And you can see the nature of the discussions is almost a new domain. Talking about the policy issues, about the nexus, about the complementarity, about the impact, about all these issues are new domain internationally. So if you're interested in international agenda, international development, international frameworks, and international doesn't mean actually a political statement, a paper. No, international means whatever is there in relationship between people and countries and states, you must engage in actually strategic and policy level discussions. That's what I think. So today's discussion was an effort to open up a little bit this type of issues and conversation and dialogue on the key concepts on sustainable development, disaster reduction, and hopefully on Sunday, then we will be focused on a couple of concrete areas, how we can integrate, what we call it, integrate disaster risk reduction into development policies and programs. So now I see that happily Dr. Farzanagan is appearing on the screen, and we are very delighted to see you. And thanks very much for all efforts and organizing this workshop. I would be very pleased and delighted to have you also speak and share your thoughts and views as you wish. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Mohaghegh. First, apologize for my late arrival because I had today some block seminar and teaching at university. So I'm happy that you are here, and my colleagues from Iran Strong Motion Network are also here, Dr. Esaghi and Dr. Shahwar. I say hello to them as well, beside the NaDiMa team, and also other participants who have been also following this debate today. Interested, Dr. Mohaghegh, to know your opinion regarding the role of formal institutions in affecting the human cost of natural disasters. So you are working in United Nations Institute and active in the topic of helping countries or giving advice to governments in dealing with the variety of disaster types and how to control and reduce the cost and risk. But as you also mentioned, the natural disaster are one factor, but more important other factors are the role of institutions. And we have heard much that, for example, the administrative corruption in projects, in infrastructure projects, in building constructions, have also amplified the costs of disasters, especially in developing countries. But what was your personal experience about the role of public corruption, for example, in Iran, in increasing the vulnerability of people and communities regarding disaster? Do you see any serious deficit, institutional deficit in this aspect? And what would be your recommendation and suggestions as somebody who has been working in this field for a while, for a couple of years, and what is your personal opinion on the role of institutions?
Thank you for the question, Dr. Farzan. I think this is a very substantial topic. Let me put it in the official framework in international agenda, what is called. As you know very well, we put it once in the framework of the good governance and management. I can refer to a joint, what we call it CCA, Common Country Assessment or Analysis, which was done 15 years ago in Iran with the United Nations. And that was the last Common Country Assessment, and there was no other since. That report actually referred to many advancement and progress which Iran was making. I think that was around 2003-4, something like that. Like public health, like education, reducing the illiteracy, etc., etc. But the report also referred to challenges which were ahead of Iran for the future then. There were actually two major challenges that the report mentioned. One was actually the securing good governance and management. So similar to the policy discussion that we had today, that United Nations assessment, which was done jointly with the government of Iran, was saying that Iran is making lots of progress, different sectors, public health, education, etc., etc. But one critical area which is not improving as well is the good governance and management. And good governance in the international literature, UN actually system involves a lot of areas, from democratic processes to the participatory approach, human rights, etc., etc. But one big part of it was this policy discussion that we are having today. So good governance management was the first challenge for Iran as per result of this assessment. The second one was inequities. And as you and other participants know, we have equality and equity, and they are very different. Equality is just absolute equality. Equity is about equality of opportunities between genders, between rural urban inhabitants, between different social classes, etc., etc. And this widening gap in inequities actually was the second challenge was mentioned. So if you look at these two, I think we can see that many problems and challenges that have been observed in Iran in the recent decade or so are coming from these two. Good governance on lack of good governance management. Other one actually is that increasing inequities in different categories. So here, obviously, when we talk about the good governance, first and foremost, we talk about the rule of law, judiciary actually independence and effectiveness. Then we talk about the institutional capacities, competencies. This list is long. So if these elements are not there, then it means that we don't have good governance. And you can measure also accountability and go so on forth on. So there are a lot of factors in it, but overall, the issue and the corruption that you're mentioning is a result of the weakness in this chain of good governance. If there is not enough accountability, rule of law, judiciary independence, and institutional capacities, and etc., that will induce actually, will be a fertile line for actually corruption. That goes on. And then when we talk to disaster risk reduction, sustainable development, this is more self-evident. You know that, for example, and colleagues, we have very advanced code of buildings in Iran on building safety, earthquake safety regulations, etc., etc. And I know by proof that they are not less actually advanced than many countries. But the problem is application. And here, in order for these rules to be applied, there is need for accountability and rule of law. Since the two are not, then we have actually a disruption between rules and regulations like safety regulation, buildings, safety, and also the other objectives of the country, which is well-being, welfare, safety, etc. And this actually is part of, again, this policy discussion. That what are the solutions? And there is no agreement on that. If you talk to different people, they have different actually ideas. And this diversity and lack of agreement is an evidence that there is no any consensus and agreement on the good solutions. So therefore, as a summary from my side, absolutely, these malfunctions and deficiencies such as corruption affect the development as well as safety and resilience of people. These deficiencies is part of the bigger issue, and that is the lack of good governance and management. And in addition to this factor, there are many other factors. So when we come to, as a sort of hopefully a bit of clear conclusion in this discussion from my side, I think this is why I was stressing a lot on the policy discussions. So colleagues in BHRC cannot be satisfied, let's be so blunt and honest, with the best regulations on building code or building safety that the people become safer. No. The people do not become safe simply and only because of the good safety regulations or because of the good standards of construction, or actually, no, because in addition to the safety regulations and knowledge and science, there is need for other parameters. That's the rule of law, accountability, good governance, good management, etc., etc. But I totally agree with you, and then it's becoming more evident if you combine it with the development agenda. So risk reduction and development is a good intersection to show the deficiencies that are popping up and coming up because of the fundamental deficiencies such as the corruption or malfunctions, but they are very much interlinked. Yeah.
A brief remark or the question again here, how your institution, you're part of United Nations and active
Yes.
in Tehran, and
Yes.
to what extent your institution was involved in the topic of sustainable development as long as that is related to disaster issues in Iran? Was there a systematic program to reduce these risks and involve the civil society in Iran in this dialogue? And what was your progress
Yes.
or activities? So that
Okay.
was
Good. Good. Thanks for asking this question. I think this is very pertinent. Yes, we were invited to help the government to integrate disaster risk reduction in national development planning. And as you know, and others know, every country has a long-term development plan or framework, or actually a document. In Iran, there is a 5-year development plan each 5 years, and now the country is preparing the 7th National Development Plan, or NDPs. So because of the lot of information sharing, exchanges, awareness, they were interested to see that how National Development Plan can play a role, and that's the most important place. Because if at highest level, the country can recognize, first, this country is disaster prone, and whatever I want to achieve should be mindful of the risk of disaster. Secondly, the root cause of disasters are not nature. It's not nature. The root cause is the wrong development policies and programs. And where is the development? Somewhere in sectoral, like education, health, urban planning. But the more important one is the highest level national development plan. We should instruct, we should guide the rest of the system government to plan and implement development projects and funding, etc., in what we call it risk-informed development approach. A development which is based on good understanding of the risk that the country is facing. And this risk can undermine the results of the development. And as I mentioned in this presentation too, that there were cases that the countries were turned back decades because of the disaster. So what we did actually, we organized at least one training workshop, exchanges. We provided the concepts and the calculations that if you invest in disaster risk reduction for $1, then you can prevent cost of $15 for disaster losses and damages. And what integration means, how it can be done, is we are in the beginning of the process. It has been just one step, so we are waiting to see the result. But this is the highest level action that any government can take to bring the question of disaster risk at highest level in national development plan. Say that I don't care which sector you're working, health, education, urban planning, environment, no. Any sector you're working, ministries, line ministries, government, you must consider and integrate disaster risk reduction from top. And this is why disaster insurance is not developed yet, because Ministry of Economy or Economic Affairs has not been involved substantively, or environment has been separate, or education has not attended. Therefore, there is need from the highest level development planning, not only as a sort of a statement, but a genuine integration of disaster risk reduction across all sectors, so that they cannot make any development plan, unless they are able to see how disaster risk affects their objectives and achievements, and how disaster risk reduction can help to protect their development gains and achievements. We are not responsible for development planning in Iran, but because of the close relationship between disaster risk reduction and development, as I'm promoting, like today's workshop, then we provided our support, and we are a regional center for Asia Pacific, but Iran is the host and a very vulnerable country, so we have to help. But normally, UN country teams who are country offices in Iran, and there are about 18 in Iran, like UNESCO, WHO, UN Habitat, FAO, they are responsible, and they have 5-year program of cooperation with government of Iran or many other governments, about 100 countries. It was called in the past United Nations Development Assistance Framework, UNDAF, 5-year. But now, since last year, it has changed. The new document or program is called United Nations Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework, UNSCCF. And now in Iran, they are working on the new 5-year cooperation from government of Iran, and all these discussions going on there. So I participate and try to help UN team in Iran to be aware of the relationship between disaster risk reduction. Disaster risk reduction, as we see, is not only rescue relief when there's an earthquake. No. Disaster risk reduction means to prevent and reduce risk at largest scale, economically, socially, environmentally, etc. And it's a global issue, so it's not only Iran alone in this. But elsewhere also in the region, Asia Pacific, we are having collaboration with several countries. And we try, even might be useful, interesting for you and also other participants, that in our even disaster information management and knowledge, the today issues, policy issues. They have many scientists, many technicians. Data and information is not a problem. There are tons of oceans of information. But the problem is that the decision makers who are not disaster experts cannot use this data. If you present a complex seismic map to an economic manager or a minister, what he or she can do with that? Nothing. This seismic map or environment map or flood map should be converted to the language of economy. And with the economic estimation, calculations, language, so they can see the impact of disaster risk. Otherwise, if you show only seismic map, earthquake, floods, drought, so okay, what? But if you tell that how much disaster risk affect the GDP of a country in 5 years, 10 years time, then they will be alerted. And like this. So a few reflections. Yeah.
Clarification. If you may me also a comment on the sanctions. You mentioned the role of governance, mismanagement, corruption, especially we know on the topic of land grabbing and illegal constructions and things, which is not, of course, unique also to Iran. The other countries in our region also get negatively affected by that, and that increased the vulnerability of population regarding disasters. But recently we have also heard about, again, because of your activities in the United Nations, the international institution, to what extent you believe that the international sanctions which have been imposed on Iran, especially by the United States, have increased the vulnerability of Iranian society with respect to natural disaster? What is the channel of effects, and what is the mechanism behind the role of the sanction? Recently, we also heard in this global discussion on the climate change, which is ongoing, that Iran will follow these climate global warming policy recommendation, but after removal of the sanction. How much you give weight to the role of economic sanctions in the story of natural disaster management in the context of Iran, compared to the other important institutional factors like the quality of governance that you
I think a lot, and that is not a secret. Everybody says that. United Nations obviously is also very blunt and clear about that the sanctions had affected negatively and hugely the capacity of the country on both sides, on development side, socio-economic development, obviously for reducing, limiting the resources, incomes, welfare, and also on the humanitarian side, like the issues during actually the COVID-19 pandemic, etc., etc. I think that's a fact, so no one can deny that. When it comes to the evidence on how the sanctions actually affected, I think it can be seen different areas. First of all, I think the distraction of the country from its development direction, normal functions, to a lot of politicized sort of tension-oriented actually engagement, that is the biggest loss. And then together with that, lack of actually income due to the limited oil exportation, international actually sort of collaboration, and the services that the country used to receive. So there are a domino or what we call it cascading risk. We have a term which is called cascading risk. If, for example, there is a flood, then there is a pandemic, then there is a agricultural disaster, then there is the economic tension, then this is like a cascading risk that can brush and wash everything. So sanctions obviously has been a big factor to impede development of Iran, general, to cause humanitarian actually challenges, and to slow down actually the collaboration, international and regional. In our work, we have some logistical challenges, like the limit to the international telecommunication services sometimes, but with the special permission UN has and privileges that has everywhere, we were happily not very much affected, especially as information and data center. That was critical for us, but for others, obviously it affected a lot. And I think it cannot be denied. And well, how it is related to the governance and management issues and policy making, that's obvious. But it's a very, very complex geopolitical and high-level issue. I think it requires a lot of other solutions in order to be solved. That's my personal opinion. But I can also look, and from a positive side, consider the resilience of the people. And that's not to justify the deficiencies. That is not to actually justify the lack of actually proper management governance. No. The countries in disaster risk reduction literature, we say, that are exposed to crises, to disasters, to etc., they have a lot of development losses. That's true. But the resilience is also developed. So I lived many years in Switzerland in the past. So I remember cases when there was one flood or one shortage of food, the cities could be collapsed really. The people did not have the expectation that some services could be, maybe also in Europe, everywhere. Or I think in this case, it was the resilience of the people, both physical resilience and mental resilience. And I don't want to say that it's positive and should be forever. No, that's wrong. But in reality, the country as a whole, especially the people, have shown great resilience. In terms of absorbing the shocks, the tension, they suffered, but they did not collapse. And I've been, in my 25 years experience, in other countries where some disasters and a conflict, actually the country was collapsed. And you can see the social disconnection everywhere. So as a summary, sanction definitely played a very negative role. It's a fact. The losses are evident on development side, on humanitarian side, on social side, and definitely did not help disaster risk reduction, resilience building. But from other side, I could talk later probably more on this COVID-19. If you remember, in the early days, many developed countries like United States, Britain, and some Europeans were shocked and actually challenged because they were not ready for it. As a focus on the referral hospital services for decades, they did not see any need for public health actually outreach. In countries like in Iran, I don't want to say that COVID was treated nicely in Iran. No, it's not the point. It's just a difference of system. Developed countries for decades forgot almost about the outreach public health services because there was no need. Anyone was sick actually could go to referral hospital for all services. But in developing countries like in Iran, still public health outreach to the forest remote areas in rural areas exists. And that was a good experience for this type of disasters, which is what we call it extensive risk. We have intensive risks such as earthquake, flash floods, and we have extensive risks such as pandemics, such as drought, such as road accident. That is wide and extensive in terms of frequency and geography. So for this, I think in COVID-19 pandemic, countries like Iran, because of their public health outreach and infrastructure, were able to mobilize fast. There were problems on vaccinations, on medicine, no problem. But in terms of public awareness and education, I think they managed, together with the resilience that the country has gained, people anyway got resilience, they treat it. I think these are the points that in the modern disaster reduction literature are coming up, like this health, climate, and disaster nexus that is now almost established. And can be changing the future of disaster reduction and development agenda, especially when it comes to the new crises that are actually global, like COVID-19 pandemic. But again, sanctions have played a very, very negative role in all these things.
Or ask any comments, and the other part as well, feel free to involve in discussion.
Hi, Dr. Farzanaghan. Thank you, Dr. Mohaghegh. It was really interesting for myself. I'm just asking if you can kindly just give some general information for the presentation, or what is the planning for Sunday workshop? I'm just wondering what would be the continuation of this workshop. I appreciate if you give some explanation. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. I think the plan is from now, after addressing the key concepts and frameworks and fundamental issues, we go to the real exercise of integration of disaster risk reduction into development planning. So we now have seen and witnessed their correlation and then reciprocal relation between the two. But if we want to do, we integrate disaster risk reduction, let's say in urban planning or environment, how we can do that. So that's the focus of the workshop on Sunday. So how in practice, and it will be more concrete and less abstract. So more fun, hopefully, for the experts in the applied science actually disciplines. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
So we have room for questions. So Sunday would be the second part of the workshop, Dr. Mohaghegh, and as was planned, we continue this interesting event. So is there any other questions? So I don't have any further comments, Dr. Mohaghegh. Thank you very much also for your very interesting and informative illustration of these theoretical topics. And as you mentioned, on the Sunday there would be more application on the issue that you mentioned.
Yeah, sure.
So
I mean,
Dr. Shahla,
yes, please. Go ahead, Doctor.
yeah, go ahead, go ahead. Now, I wanted to see if Dr. Shahwar would like also to add or to have any comments on the points which raised by you.
Yes.
Otherwise,
Yes. Now it's unmuted.
okay. Now, yes.
I think maybe it's a internet problem because
Okay.
so many of the other participants had the problem for the participation. Two
Yeah.
of them, they couldn't even talk because of the internet issue. So I think he's dealing with internet issue as well.
Okay. Good. Dr. Mohaghegh, continue then, please.
No, thanks. I just wanted to highlight that this discipline or area of dialogue or discussion is not really sectoral. It's an extremely multi-sectoral and methodological sort of approach for dealing with these issues. And therefore, we are not really introducing any tool or any system. This is just improving our skills and ability, hopefully, and knowledge about the very complex relationship between these multidisciplinary areas. And this is just an excuse to be aware of that, of the fact that development programs can be successful only and if we take into consideration the other important factors, such as the risk that we are facing. And it's not abstract. Countries like Iran have had a lot of resources and plans, etc. But because of these risks and disasters and shocks and crises have been pushed back, regardless of the reasons. Yeah, we can discuss it separately. But this is not only Iran. Many countries in the world, and we know them one by one, have been actually pushed back. And at the same time, countries who manage disaster risk reduction well have advanced so well. And the latest good example is Bangladesh, a country that I've been many times in the past in there. We just thinking actually helping millions of the people just to survive. And until 20 years ago, there were these monsoon annual actually cyclones. 10 million people were affected, thousands were killed, poverty, everything. But in the past 10, 15 years, Bangladesh did a lot with the community preparedness, disaster management, risk reduction, and then recently graduated from a least developed country to a developing country. And we can see the result in their engagement, plans, policy discussions, recommendations, economic investment, international economic investment, Bangladesh. That's your domain, Dr. Farzanagan, you know it very well. So what I'm trying to say is that these issues are real and can affect positively or negatively the destiny of the people and countries if they do not. Some of them are political risks, security crisis, some of them are natural hazards, but the concept of disaster risk composed of hazards, vulnerability, and exposure is correct everywhere. Whether it's a political security risk, or is a natural hazard risk, or is an industrial risk, or is an economic recession, or actually a crisis that the countries face. So the logic, I think, is important, that we consider all factors and actors in that. So hopefully that can help to our multidisciplinary strategic level of thinking in all what we do, in any domain or any discipline. Yeah. So there was a question, how can we access the presentations? I assume that colleagues in university will share these presentations, huh? With upload to this presentation, we could. Yeah, also my presentation that I did, so colleagues can put in access of everyone, all participants. That's would be useful for Sunday also session and exercise. Yeah, so the link then can be shared So hopefully it would be useful for the further and future engagement of the participants. Yeah. Now, I just want also to highlight one more point to the participants. This type of dialogue and discussion doesn't happen often everywhere. So I think this has been a great opportunity for participants who work in different technical, academic, or executive areas. But this chance for such conversation, actually, strategic policy level, multi-sectoral, doesn't appear and happen everywhere. Okay, good. So someone is warming up the car's engine.
Okay, so Dr. Mohaghegh, I think, I don't know if we lost Dr. Farzan again as well. So if there is no question or comments, or if you don't have any other points, maybe we can finish the session and
Yeah, sure.
meet
I was
again,
wondering
hopefully
if,
on Sunday.
yeah, sure. No, I was just wondering if Dr. Farzanagan has any other final remarks to make, then we can close. If Dr. Farzanagan,
Yeah.
No, I have
He's
no
back.
further
Welcome back,
comments.
Dr. Farzan.
I have no further comment. Thank you very much, Dr. Mohaghegh, for discussion, and sorry again for being late in the meeting.
no, all
And
right,
also
no problem.
thanks Dr. Saghir, Dr. Shahbar for helping us today also in organizing this workshop. We looking forward then for Sunday. The meeting on the
Yeah,
Sunday. We still have, after your workshop, another workshop in November, our final workshop in this year, 2021. That would be the end of November, and it is already available, the information on our website, on the NaDiMa website, for those who are interested. Yes, and of course, we have one concluding panel discussion on the NaDiMa in December, that the information will be published soon also about that event. But from my side, I would like to thank everybody, participants and other presenters, and you,
yes.
especially Dr. Mohaghegh, for this very interesting, informative talk, and looking forward for the meeting on Sunday. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you, Dr. and all colleagues. It was wonderful to attend this collective effort and with rich discussion. So on Sunday, hopefully we'll continue our journey to reach some clear and good destinations. Thank you. Thank you so much, and everyone.